4 travelers vanished in the scorching heart of Death Valley. And for decades, the desert kept its deadly secret. What really happened to the Death Valley Germans? Today, we're peeling back layers of mystery, retracing their last steps, and uncovering the chilling truth hidden beneath decades of silence. Welcome back, history detectives. In today's deep dive, we revisiting one of America's most haunting desert mysteries, the disappearance of the Death Valley Germans in 1996, a family's dream vacation turned into a decades-long enigma. Their story mixes adventure, danger, and the unforgiving beauty of Death Valley, a puzzle that baffled experts, haunted families, and kept the world guessing until one shocking discovery changed everything. The story begins in the summer of 1996, a time when the world was still finding its feet with technology. There were no smartphones buzzing in our pockets, no GPS tracking every move. Vacations were planned with fold-out maps, guidebooks, and the hope that nothing unexpected would turn your journey upside down. And into this world stepped 4 German tourists: Cornelia Meyer, Egbert Rimkus, his young son Georg, and Egbert's girlfriend, Cornelia's close friend. They were far from home, filled with excitement, ready to conquer the vastness of the American West. They had flown in from Germany to Los Angeles, rented a modest minivan, and set off on what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. California, with its glitzy cities, winding highways, and dramatic landscapes, was a dream destination for countless travelers. But for this group, it wasn't the cities that called to them, it was the open road, the sense of freedom, the rugged beauty of deserts and canyons that Europe couldn't quite offer in the same way. Their journey began like any other tourist adventure. Photos snapped in front of landmarks, smiles beaming under the hot American sun. A rented Plymouth Voyager carrying everything they needed: maps, water, food, and the kind of excitement that comes when you thousands of miles from home exploring a foreign land. Friends and family back in Germany received postcards and letters describing the beauty of California, the thrill of the trip, the plans to see as much as possible before heading back home. On July 22nd, records show they checked into a motel in Las Vegas. It was the kind of place countless tourists pass through every week. Nothing unusual about 4 German travelers staying there for a night. Receipts and hotel logs confirmed they were there. They refueled their van, bought supplies, and according to those same records, they planned to head toward Yosemite National Park, one of the crown jewels of the American West. But what happened next set them on a path far from the safety of well-traveled roads. For reasons still debated today, they changed course. Somewhere between leaving Las Vegas and that next planned destination, they made a choice that would change everything. Instead of heading north toward the lush forests and granite cliffs of Yosemite, they veered into one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America, Death Valley. Imagine the scene. The middle of July, temperatures soaring well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of dry, relentless heat that sucks the moisture from your body before you even realize it. Death Valley isn't just hot, it's remote, vast, and deceptive. Roads stretch endlessly with no signs of life, no shade, no gas stations for miles. Locals know better than to underestimate it. But to travelers unfamiliar with its dangers, it can feel like just another scenic detour on the way to somewhere else. The group stopped at Furnace Creek, a small outpost in Death Valley where tourists often grab maps, water, and information before venturing deeper. Here, a park employee reportedly spoke with them briefly. There was nothing alarming in that exchange, just tourists asking about routes, distances, maybe even shortcuts. Then, with little fanfare, the group drove westward into the vastness of the valley. What makes this moment so haunting is that it was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. After Furnace Creek, the trail of the Death Valley Germans goes cold. Later, investigators would piece together their movements from scattered clues. A signed guestbook at a remote spot known as Warm Springs Canyon. Tire tracks where the van had clearly gone off the main road and onto rougher, riskier terrain. But in real time, back in July of 1996, no one knew any of this. As far as friends and family in Germany were concerned, the travelers were continuing their adventure, sending photos, calling occasionally when they reached a town with payphones, and enjoying the trip of a lifetime. But the postcards stopped coming, the phone calls never came, their rental van never returned. And as days turned into weeks, concern turned into alarm. Somewhere between the neon lights of Las Vegas and the sun-baked silence of Death Valley, 4 lives had slipped off the map, leaving behind only questions, fragments of clues, and a growing sense of dread that something had gone terribly wrong. The sun in Death Valley doesn't just shine, it burns, smothers, and dominates everything beneath it. By the time the German tourists left Furnace Creek and ventured deeper into the valley, the temperature was climbing past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There are a few places on Earth where the heat feels so alive, like an invisible predator stalking anyone bold enough to cross its territory. Even in a car with air conditioning, the desert seeps in, pressing against the glass, waiting for the moment when man and machine falter. Somewhere along their route, the family made choices that remain as mysterious as they are haunting. Maps recovered later showed the roads they could have taken safe, paved highways that skirted the worst parts of Death Valley, leading back to civilization. Yet the van didn't stay on those roads. It veered off onto dirt tracks, rough trails that locals knew better than to travel in midsummer. These weren't routes for tourists. They were paths for the prepared, the ones carrying extra fuel, gallons of water, and the kind of desert experience that told you when to turn back. Why they chose that route remains a puzzle. Perhaps they were chasing adventure, the thrill of seeing the desert up close rather than through a car window on the highway. Perhaps a misunderstanding with the map made the trail look like a shortcut, a quicker way to Yosemite. Maybe there was something enticing about the dotted lines on the paper maps they carried, lines that looked harmless in ink, but cut through some of the most isolated terrain in the country. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The Plymouth Voyager, a sturdy rental minivan, could handle dirt roads for a while. They had supplies, some water, food enough for the day, and as the van climbed into the foothills beyond the valley floor, the scenery would have been breathtaking. Jagged ridges, dry canyons carved by ancient floods, stretches of land so empty they felt like another planet. For a family from Germany used to villages and highways never too far apart, the sheer scale of Death Valley must have felt both exhilarating and unsettling. Somewhere in Warm Springs Canyon, they stopped long enough to sign a guest book left at an abandoned mining outpost. That signature would become a breadcrumb for searchers years later, proof they had made it this far. But it also raised another question: why keep going? Because beyond Warm Springs, the trails grow rougher, climbing into higher, harsher country where even experienced off-roaders hesitate in summer heat. The van pressed on. Tire tracks later examined showed they struggled at points, the vehicle weaving, stopping, starting again, as though the passengers debated whether to continue or turn back. Every mile took them farther from paved roads, from help, from any chance encounter with another traveler who might guide them out. The desert in July sees few visitors. The heat drives away all but the most determined. Out here, in the shimmering silence, it's easy to feel like the last people on Earth. As the day wore on, temperatures inside the van must have climbed. Air conditioners in rental vehicles aren't built for non-stop desert driving, and when they fail, the interior turns into an oven. If they rolled down windows, the wind offered no relief, only blasts of air as hot as the breath of a furnace. Water bottles emptied quickly. The adults, unfamiliar with just how fast dehydration strikes in such conditions, might have rationed too cautiously at first, saving supplies for later, not realizing later would demand far more than they carried. At some point, the van reached a dead end where the rough track became too narrow, too steep or too washed out to continue. Investigators would one day find tire marks showing, where the driver tried turning around, a complicated maneuver on the uneven ground. From there, the story grows darker. The van was found years later with windows shattered by time and heat, its tires deflated, and no sign of its passengers. The keys were gone, so were the people. Searchers could only imagine the scene. 4 travelers stepping out into the searing afternoon, carrying what little water remained, looking out over miles of barren ridges, and valleys stretching endlessly in every direction. No roads, no shade, no sign of life. The horizon trembling in waves of heat that distorted everything like a mirage waiting to betray them back in Germany. Family and friends waited for updates that never came. Days passed, then weeks, until the silence could no longer be explained by sightseeing or spotty payphones. Concern turned to dread, and soon calls were made to U.S. authorities reporting 4 German tourists missing in the American West. Their names were entered into official logs, a case number assigned, and the search for answers began. On the American side, law enforcement didn't have much to work with in the beginning. All they knew was the family had rented a minivan in Los Angeles, checked into a motel in Las Vegas, and never showed up for their flight home. No one had seen them since. The rental company reported the vehicle overdue. Credit card records stopped cold. The trail was as dry as the desert itself. At first, searches focused on populated areas, highways, rest stops, motels where travelers might have stayed if they'd run into car trouble. Police checked hospitals in case of accidents, jails in case of misunderstandings, even border crossings in case they had unexpectedly left the country. But nothing turned up. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed them whole. Then came the first real clue. Somewhere deep in Death Valley, a park ranger came across a guest book at the Warm Springs mining outpost. Inside, dated July 23rd, was a familiar set of names, the missing Germans. They had been there. That single discovery shifted the entire focus of the search. Suddenly, investigators weren't looking at highways or cities anymore. They were staring at a map of Death Valley, a place the size of Connecticut with temperatures hot enough to kill in hours. Rescue teams mobilized. Helicopters scanned the valleys and ridges, their crews peering down at endless stretches of sand, rock, and shadow. On the ground, searchers followed dirt roads in 4-wheel drives, hoping to spot the blue and white Plymouth Voyager or any sign of its passengers. Volunteers joined in, locals who knew the desert's dangers better than anyone. But the search area was staggering in size. Death Valley is not a single valley, but a maze of canyons, mountains, and dry basins, each capable of hiding secrets for decades. Days of searching turned into weeks. The heat was merciless, even for rescuers. Helicopter pilots reported shimmering mirages, making it hard to distinguish real tracks from tricks of the light. Ground teams carried water in bulk, knowing one wrong turn could put them in the same danger as the people they were trying to find. Every tire mark was examined. Every dry wash and canyon floor was checked. The only sound beyond the rotors and engines was the wind scraping across the rocks, as if the desert itself mocked their efforts. The van remained elusive. Without it, the searchers had no center point, no way to know which direction the missing family might have walked if they left the vehicle behind. Some believed they were stranded somewhere waiting for help. Others feared the worst, that the heat had claimed them long before rescuers even began looking. Rumors began to swirl. Tourists talked about possible sightings that never panned out. Amateur desert explorers speculated online and in letters to newspapers, offering theories that ranged from carjackings to alien abductions. The mystery had all the ingredients to capture public imagination: a foreign family, a legendary desert, and a disappearance with almost no evidence to explain it. The search efforts eventually scaled back, not because anyone wanted to quit, but because the desert allows only so much before it swallows hope as easily as it swallows footprints. Months later, the official search ended, leaving behind unanswered questions and grieving families an ocean away. The case file stayed open, but with no new leads, it gathered dust like everything else the wind leaves behind in Death Valley. For the families back in Germany, the silence was unbearable. They pushed for answers, wrote letters, demanded the case stay active. Journalists picked up the story, calling it the mystery of the Death Valley Germans. Each article brought brief flares of attention, but without new evidence, the headlines faded, replaced by other stories, other tragedies. Meanwhile, the desert kept its secret. Years passed, and the disappearance settled into the realm of legend. One of those unsolved cases people whispered about whenever they drove through the empty stretches of Death Valley, looking out at the horizon and wondering how 4 people could vanish so completely in a place crossed by maps and satellites, yet still wild enough to hide them from the world as months turned into years. The story of the missing German tourists began to drift into that unsettling space between tragedy and legend. Officially, the case remained open, but with no new leads, no sightings, and no recovered vehicle, the mystery seemed frozen in time. For the families back in Germany, each day without answers felt like an eternity. There were birthdays missed, holidays passed in silence, and empty chairs at dinner tables that no amount of hope could fill. Letters to U.S. authorities continued, pleading for updates, for any clue at all, but most came back with the same heartbreaking message. There was nothing new to report. Meanwhile, in Death Valley, the desert went on as it always had, scorching summers. Brief cool winters, winds carving the land inch by inch. It is a place that erases evidence with a kind of cruel efficiency. Tire tracks vanish under shifting sands, bones bleach and scatter in the wind, and the relentless sun strips away everything but silence. Search teams had scoured the likely areas in the beginning, but Death Valley is so vast, so rugged that even dozens of people looking for weeks can miss a single vehicle tucked into a canyon or hidden behind a ridge. And as the years slipped by, the chances of finding anything seemed to fade like footprints on a dry wash after a windstorm, yet the mystery refused to die. It lingered in newspapers, in travel forums, in the minds of those who lived near the desert. Tourists passing through would sometimes ask locals about the missing Germans, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. What haunted people most was the lack of explanation. How could 4 people in a modern era with roads and maps and helicopters disappear so completely? There had been other tragedies in Death Valley, hikers who underestimated the heat, drivers who strayed too far from main roads, but those stories usually ended with recovery, with answers. This one did not. Speculation began to fill the vacuum left by facts. Some believed the family had taken a wrong turn deep into the backcountry, run out of gas or water, and simply succumbed to the heat. Others suggested foul play, pointing to the remoteness of the area and the possibility of encountering the wrong person at the wrong time. A few theories grew wilder tales of secret military sites, hidden cults, or even paranormal explanations whispered on late-night radio shows where mysteries like this find eager audiences. The internet, still new in the late 1990s, began to play its part too. Message boards carried threads about the case, with armchair detectives analyzing maps and speculating about routes the tourists might have taken. Some users claimed to have hiked parts of Death Valley looking for clues themselves. Every so often, a hiker or prospector would report finding something, a piece of clothing, a bottle, a scrap of metal, but nothing ever connected definitively to the missing travelers. Each lead raised hopes briefly before fading into another dead end. For law enforcement and park rangers, the case was as frustrating as it was haunting. They had no crime scene, no confirmed last location beyond that Warm Springs guest book, and no witnesses after that day. Without a recovered vehicle, they couldn't even be sure which direction the family had traveled after leaving the mining outpost. The desert, as one ranger put it, simply swallowed them whole. The emotional toll on the families was immeasurable. They traveled to the United States more than once, retracing the known parts of the route, speaking with police, even hiring private investigators at times. Each trip ended the same way, with no closure, no remains to bring home, no certainty about what had happened in those final hours in the desert. Back in Germany, the story occasionally resurfaced in newspapers and on television, always with the same haunting question. How could an entire family vanish in a place that, on a map, seemed so close to civilization? Over time, the missing Germans became part of Death Valley's lore. Their story told alongside tales of lost gold mines, ghost towns, and vanished pioneers from a century earlier. Locals spoke of them with the kind of reverence reserved for mysteries that refuse to yield answers, a reminder that even in the modern world, some places remain as wild and unforgiving as they were centuries ago, years stretched into a decade, then more. Search efforts had long since ended, but the families never stopped hoping for a breakthrough. Somewhere out there in the canyons and ridges of Death Valley lay the truth of what happened in the summer of 1996, hidden beneath sun and stone, waiting for the day someone might stumble across it by accident, ending the silence that had lasted far too long. More than a decade had passed since the Death Valley Germans vanished without a trace. The case had faded from the headlines, reduced to a haunting story shared by locals and a file collecting dust in law enforcement archives. Families back in Germany lived with the ache of uncertainty, caught in that cruel limbo where there were no answers, no remains, no closure. For years, people wondered if the desert had swallowed every clue forever. Then, in 2009, everything changed. It began with a man named Tom Mahood, an engineer turned amateur explorer, someone fascinated by mysteries like this one. He had read about the disappearance and felt the same question that had nagged at so many others. How could 4 people vanish so completely in a modern, mapped, and patrolled place like Death Valley? Unlike most who simply speculated, Mahood decided to act. He studied maps, pored over every scrap of information available about the case, and became convinced that the answer lay in the rugged backcountry, far from the usual roads and tourist trails. Mahood was not the only one. A small network of volunteers and desert enthusiasts had grown around the mystery over the years. They traded information online, shared theories, and occasionally ventured into the wilderness, searching for signs of the missing family. Most trips ended the same way, with nothing found but heat, dust, and disappointment. But Mahood believed the key was understanding the psychology of people lost in the desert, the choices they might make when panic set in, when supplies ran low, when desperation overruled reason. In early November 2009, he and a companion set out into a remote area near Anvil Canyon, a place so rugged and isolated that even experienced hikers approached it with caution. The terrain, there is a labyrinth of ridges and ravines, where distances deceive the eye and the sun punishes every step. They carried GPS devices, plenty of water, and a determination hardened by years of failed searches. What they found that day would finally crack open the mystery that had lingered for 13 long years. Scattered across the rocky ground, they discovered human remains, partial, weathered by time and elements, but unmistakably human. Nearby lay scraps of clothing, a shoe, and other personal items bleached by the relentless desert sun. As they documented the site, the grim picture began to form. This was no accident scene near a road or a campsite. This was deep in the backcountry, miles from the nearest pavement, in a place few would reach unless truly desperate or hopelessly lost. News of the discovery spread quickly. Law enforcement returned to the site, collecting the remains for analysis. Investigators soon confirmed what many had suspected but no one could prove for 13 years. The remains belonged to the missing German tourists. The rental van had been found years earlier, abandoned miles from the site, but until now, there had been no sign of the people themselves. The location of the remains raised as many questions as it answered. They were found more than a dozen miles from the van, suggesting the family had tried to walk out after the vehicle became unusable. But the direction puzzled searchers and experts alike. Instead of heading toward the nearest highway or known water sources, they had traveled into even more remote terrain, as though disoriented or misled by the brutal landscape. Some theorized they might have seen distant lights or mirages and followed them, believing help lay in that direction. Others suggested panic drove them onward, a desperate instinct to keep moving even when logic said to stay put. The discovery brought a flood of emotions. For the families, there was at last some measure of closure after years of uncertainty, though grief resurfaced as they confronted the reality of what had happened. For searchers and locals, the find was both relief and sorrow, a mystery partly solved, but tinged with the haunting knowledge of how close previous searches had come without finding the site. The remains had lain there through all those years of helicopters, volunteers, and rangers scouring the desert, hidden by the vastness and cruelty of the land. Experts studying the case noted how survival chances in Death Valley plummet quickly once a vehicle breaks down or water runs out. In that heat, with little shade and no reliable landmarks, even the strongest travelers can become disoriented, dehydrated, and exhausted within hours. The Germans had likely left the van seeking help, unaware of just how far civilization really was across those empty miles. Their final trek through Anvil Canyon became a silent witness to desperation under the desert sun, a path marked only by the belongings and bones left behind until chance finally revealed them 13 years later. Even after the discovery in 2009, after investigators confirmed the remains belonged to the missing German tourists, the story refused to rest quietly. Yes, the remains were found. Yes, the van had been located years before. And yes, the evidence suggested they had tried to walk out of the desert after becoming stranded. But the full picture, the why, the how, the final desperate hours remained shrouded in the same desert silence that had swallowed their trail for 13 years. The first question that haunted everyone was their route. Experienced hikers, investigators, even locals who knew Death Valley intimately all studied the maps with furrowed brows. The path the Germans had taken didn't make sense. From where the van was abandoned, the nearest highway lay in one direction, the nearest water source in another. But instead, the family had walked into a part of the desert that grew rougher, hotter, and more unforgiving with every mile. Some wondered if they had seen something in the distance, maybe a reflection, the glint of sunlight on metal, even distant lights after dark, and believed help waited there. Others speculated that panic had clouded their judgment, that dehydration and heat stroke had confused their sense of direction long before the final day. Then came the question of timing. The van had been abandoned in July, in the height of Death Valley's brutal summer. Daytime temperatures soared past 120 degrees. Investigators trying to reconstruct the timeline believed the family might have survived a day, maybe two after leaving the vehicle, depending on how much water they carried and how far they walked before exhaustion set in. The remains were found over 12 miles from the van. That distance under such conditions seemed almost impossible to some experts, yet there they were, proof that the family had pressed on for hours, maybe longer, before the desert finally claimed them. But there were other unsettling details. Not all the remains were found together. Some were scattered by animals or the elements, but the distances raised questions. Had the group stayed together until the end, or had some tried to keep moving while others collapsed from exhaustion? Survival experts pointed out that as dehydration worsens, confusion sets in, decisions grow erratic, and people sometimes separate unintentionally in a desperate search for help. The desert gives no second chances. The rental van itself added another layer of mystery. Found years earlier by a hiker, it sat abandoned, tires flat, windows broken by time and heat. Investigators noted that supplies had been left behind, empty bottles, some belongings suggesting the family took only what they could carry before setting out on foot. But why leave the relative shelter of the vehicle? Survival guides often stress staying with your car in remote areas because it provides shade, visibility for rescuers, and a stationary point for search teams to find. Had the family believed they were too far off established routes for anyone to spot them? Or had they simply underestimated the distances, convinced civilization lay just over the next ridge? The more investigators pieced together, the more the case became a study in human decision-making under extreme stress. A wrong turn, a failed vehicle, the merciless sun. Dwindling water, each factor alone might be survivable, but together they created a chain of events that ended in tragedy. Yet some people remained unconvinced this was the whole story. On internet forums and in late-night conversations, theories persisted. A few speculated about hidden dangers in the desert, encounters with strangers, even foul play that authorities overlooked. Nothing concrete ever supported these ideas, but mysteries like this attract speculation the way the desert attracts heat. For the families in Germany, the discovery brought answers but not peace. There was no way to know what their loved ones had thought in those final moments, no way to measure the fear or hope they carried as they walked mile after mile under the burning sky. The artifacts recovered, scraps of clothing, sun-bleached bones, told only fragments of the story. The rest lived in silence. Even today, hikers passing through Anvil Canyon sometimes stop and imagine the scene. A stranded van baking under the sun. 4 figures walking out into the shimmering heat, carrying bottles of water, unaware of how far they really were from help. The desert around them stretching endlessly, beautiful and deadly all at once. It is easy to picture them pausing under the thin shade of a rock outcrop, deciding whether to turn back, to keep moving, to wait for rescue that never came. Those last decisions remain locked away in time. Answers buried as deeply as the footprints the wind erased long ago. The story of the Death Valley Germans is more than just a tale of loss in the desert. It is a reminder of how quickly adventure can turn to tragedy, how a single wrong turn can unravel even the best-laid plans, and how nature, for all its beauty, holds power beyond our control. For 13 years, the desert kept its secret, scattering clues like pieces of a puzzle across a land vast enough to swallow 4 lives without a trace. Even with discoveries made, questions linger about the choices made in those final hours, about the route taken, about the sheer will it must have taken to keep walking under that relentless sun. It is a story that grips us because it exposes the limits of human endurance and the fragility of certainty. In places where the land itself seems to conspire against survival, perhaps that is why this case refuses to fade from memory. Because Death Valley still stands as it always has, silent, scorching, and indifferent, holding its mysteries in the shifting sands, reminding us that some answers come slowly and some may never come at all.